Hey everyone, Luke here at the eDrum Workshop, a new channel that's dedicated to helping you get the best out of your electronic and hybrid drums. This is the second part of a two-part guide on how to optimize your eDrums for taking on stage. This video will be going into the most common issues that you're likely to run into when you turn up at a show, how to solve them, and then some other considerations that you might not have thought of. Let's solve some problems. If you missed the first part, that was mostly about your approach to your kit sounds and how to use references to achieve the best mix, so go back and check that out if it sounds interesting to you. The most common issues that I usually run into when getting to a gig involve imbalanced kit sounds or frequencies, strange resonances that aren't apparent on your speakers at home, and things becoming muddy due to clashes with other instruments or bad kit settings. So we're going to run through this list now and we'll talk about the best ways to approach fixing these issues. Harsh snare sounds on PA speakers. I mentioned this in part 1, and what you'll often find when you get to a show is that the PA will reproduce the sounds a bit different to what you thought they would sound like. A lot of the time, the PA speakers will make it sound a lot more harsh than you were expecting. So my approach here would be to identify those problem frequencies and try to EQ them out, and then use kit effects like compression just to try and overall tame that sound and round it out. I would also make sure that the snare's level isn't too high in relation to the rest of your kit. Many drummers, myself definitely included, really like to crank their snare in the mix. I've noticed that this is very prevalent on eDrums especially because you're not getting that same sonic feedback straight from the drum like you do with an acoustic drum. So what you need to do here is make sure that your entire kit balance is good, and especially pay attention to that snare drum. Over-sustaining toms. What you tend to find is that the frequency range in which especially your rack toms sit in is often quite accentuated on some PA speakers. This really muddies up the mix if you let your toms sustain for too long. So here I would try EQing them a little bit, maybe bring down the lower frequencies on some of those rack toms, but just try not to kill the tone. And then I'd probably go into whatever dampening settings you've got available and dampen them a reasonable amount. You might need to dampen them more than you would actually like to, especially compared to how you'd like to listen to them on headphones or in some kind of studio mix, but it's definitely going to help clear up your overall sound. You will often find that many sound engineers use this exact technique with noise gates on acoustic toms at live shows for this exact reason. General muddiness. The room that you're playing in is going to add a lot of additional sound, and those reflections can start muddying up your mix, even the whole band's mix if you don't approach it right. Drying out your kit sound can really help here. You're probably not going to need copious amounts of reverb on your snare drum in a large room. You can probably get away with your kick drum having more attack and less sustain. Or if you have mic controls like you do on the Mimic Pro, you might want more of your kick-in microphone in the mix and less of your kick-out. If you have any kit resonance settings, or if there are room microphone settings like on some of the higher-end Roland modules or the Mimic, try bringing these down a bit. They all add to the immersion in your headphones, but they can go the other way and make your kit sound worse when in context with a band and in a room. Try to approach your kit mix more like a close mic'd acoustic kit, only adding effects when they're really necessary. Squashed sound. Check that you're not over-compressing your kit on the master output if you have this option too. You want your kit to sound glued together, and master compression can really help fatten out your sound, but when you go the other way with it, those squash dynamics aren't going to let all of your kit elements cut through the mix properly. If you have the option of using direct outputs, this could help you get those balances right, and it often bypasses the master effects, meaning that you can monitor your kit with your favourite settings, but have the front of house sound balanced without those settings. Also, make sure that you're not sending too hot a signal to the desk if you're doing your own sound, as the audio will get clipped or limited and it might sound like it's squashed or even like it's sort of swelling in and out. So if you've ever had that issue before, try bringing everything down a notch first. Now that we've covered most bases on the sound department, there's definitely a few other considerations that are worth looking into to make things go smoother. You'll ideally want to get ahead of these before your first foray into taking your eDrums on stage. How will you monitor yourself and the band? The biggest change going from acoustic drums to electronic drums is the difference in how you hear your instrument. The sound isn't coming directly from your drums anymore, so you need to work out your favoured monitoring solution ahead of time. If you don't need to monitor a click track or a backing track of any kind, then you might be happy with a wedge monitor, a PA speaker as a monitor, or a drum amp. Many people favour using in-ear monitors these days for eDrums, or even a combination of that and a monitor. You might only need to hear yourself, or you might need a mix of the whole band, so you'll need to consider this to know whether you need a mixer or if you're just going to be plugging straight into your module. Depending on the venues, they might supply your monitor mix with a wedge, or a top and a sub, or some will happily send you a monitor line that you can plug straight into your mixer or into your drum module, or some venues you're going to need to take your own solution. And on the flip side, your bandmates are probably going to need to hear you too, and that's going to rely on your gear, it's going to rely on their gear, so make sure you factor that into your gear choices. Next up, how are you getting your sound to the front of house? Again, this is going to depend on what kind of band you're in, what kind of venues you play, and what drum module that you own. You might need to offer up a solution for getting your sound to the mixing desk. If you play venues with tech crews or sound engineers, you're probably going to be covered. They'll likely have DI boxes to turn your jack outputs into XLRs for the front of house, but if you're using all direct outputs, there is a chance that they won't have enough DIs for all of them. So picking up a few DI boxes for yourself, or some kind of multi-DI rack unit, that might be a good shout. If you're doing your own sound, you're going to need to consider how far you're sending that signal. When we do our own sound with my party band, the PA head's not usually that far away from me, so I actually just go straight out with jacks, straight into that. But over longer distances, you're probably going to need DIs in order to avoid interference with the signal. The TD50 has XLR outputs, but only for the full stereo mix, and most other drum modules just use jack outputs. When you're bringing gear that isn't quite as industry standard to venues that only usually have certain kinds of acts on, there's no harm in being more prepared and bringing additional gear to avoid headaches. Also, depending on the module that you own, using DIs might be an additional safety precaution. Now, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on this matter at all, and I don't know all of the technicalities, so please do some additional research into this if you think it's going to apply to you. If you ever run cables that have a jack on one end and an XLR on the other, then there's a chance that if someone turns on phantom power on the desk to those inputs, then it's going to send power to your module's outputs and possibly damage the circuitry. There's been a lot of talk of this happening with the Mimic Pro's direct out and the DB25 connector. I believe that Roland modules have their wiring set up in order to prevent this, but I don't know for sure, and I definitely don't know about a lot of the other drum modules on the market. Having a DI box in between your module and the desk is supposed to help prevent this from happening. Some desks supply their phantom power on like a channel by channel basis, or some of them you turn it on and it applies it to every XLR input. It's less likely to happen if you're running jacks directly into the mixer, because I hear that on most PA heads, the phantom power isn't usually supplied to the jacks, but I also hear that some can, so I don't know for sure. The Pearl Mimic Pro group on Facebook, Justin's 65 Drums group on Facebook, and the vdrums.com forum are all really good resources to check up on this kind of thing. There's lots of people with lots of experience on this matter that can help you out. I've never experienced a problem with this myself because we usually run directly into my own desk, straight into those jack inputs, and we know who's in control of turning phantom power on and off. The only time that I've ever had my TD50 or my Mimic hooked up to a front of house that we don't have control of, it's either been through the TD50's XLR outputs or it's been through a DI box. Like I say, I am no form of authority on this subject, and I definitely don't know all the details, so it might not even be anywhere near as bad a problem as this suggests, but I thought I'd cover it just in case, and there's plenty of places that you can go to read if you need to. Okay, right, with that out of the way, bringing spares. As with acoustic drums, bringing extra things like wing nuts, cymbal felts, tension rods, extra drumsticks, drum keys, that kind of thing, that's all going to help. And now that you're running electronics, bringing some extra cables is definitely a bonus. When I take my eDrums out, I'll usually have a spare pad and a rim mount external trigger on hand, just in case, and I'll also mentally prioritise what I might need to swap around if a drum or a cymbal pad fail for some reason. It's been very uncommon for me to actually run into any of these issues, and usually when I do, it's my own fault. I did have a kick drum trigger fail on me once, but it's my own DIY kick drum, and I'd done a really hasty modification the day before, hadn't secured my wiring properly. Totally my own fault. But again, I had a spare clip-on trigger in a bag just in case. I once had a hi-hat pad stop functioning at a gig, and it ended up being down to the cable being wrapped around a pole a bit too tight. It must have just had enough tension on it that when the hi-hat pad was moving, it just pulled enough to pull that wire apart inside. Again, totally my own fault. Leave more slack on your cables. I had spare cables with me, so I just played the rest of the song out on the ride cymbal instead of the hi-hat, and then I swapped out the cable between songs and carried on. I don't personally take a spare module with me to gigs, but I know a lot of people will recommend bringing a cheap backup just in case. My biggest issue with this personally is that even cheap drum modules aren't cheap. I also liken this to other band members not having spare amps with them, and the whole band not having a spare PA head with them. We often do shows where there's no other musicians around, things like weddings, parties, holiday parks. We're the only act on that night, so things like borrowing other people's gear isn't a possibility anyway. So that age-old excuse of, well, the guitarist can just borrow another person's amp, that doesn't apply to us. We've either got to bring 2 of everything, which we just plain don't have space for, or there's some element of risk involved for every band member. Keep your gear in good condition, take every precaution that you can, and 99% of the time you're going to be fine. If you have the means to take a spare module with you, by all means go for it, it's not going to hurt. For the rest of us, a few spare cables, maybe a pad or 2, and maybe a few other bits is probably going to be enough. Additional precautions. All gigs and all gear share one thing in common. A few extra precautions is always a safe bet. There's a few little safeguards you can do, like regularly inspecting your wiring to make sure they're okay, and making sure that any plugs that you're plugging into outlets have surge protectors on them. Some people go as far as to bring power conditioners with them to make sure that the power that's going to their module is stable, and I don't really blame them. I've never had the need to do that myself, but I'm aware that the quality and stability of the power at different venues can vary quite wildly depending on where you live. Being prepared for as many problems as possible will ensure that if something does happen to go wrong, you at least have a clue on where to start solving it. Having a rehearsal with your full setup is going to be the most ideal way to make sure you can iron out any additional problems before you turn up at a show. Some people are going to look at this list and think it's insane overkill. They just turn up with the kit, they plug in, they play, and they have a great time. I've definitely managed to have that experience myself for quite a few shows, but I've also had my fair share of battles at sound checks and on stage. There's certainly some unique considerations for taking your eDrums on stage, but I think it's totally worth taking the time out to optimise your kit before you do. This way, you can turn up with all of the solutions before they even become problems, safe in the knowledge that you probably only have to tweak a few things and then you can get on with enjoying the show. Let me know down in the comments if you use your eDrums live. Am I overthinking it all? Or have I missed some really important details? Have you ever faced any of these problems yourself? Please do the YouTube things. If you liked the video, it'll really help the channel out. And I've got plenty more videos in the pipeline, so if this was useful to you in any way, please stay tuned for more. Have a great day. Cheers.